What a powerful film. Hi, I'm Anna Hirsh. I'm the Manager of Collections and Research at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, and we will be welcoming Sharon in a moment. Firstly, I'd like to recognise the traditional custodians of the lands in this region, the Wadawurrung people, as well as the custodians of the lands that I reside and work on, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to the land and waterways. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend this to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia. So it's an honour to welcome filmmaker Sharon Ryba-Kahn to this discussion and thank her for creating such a compelling film, Displaced. Hi Sharon, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
And as we could see in the film, Sharon was born and spent her early years in Munich and has lived in various places, including Israel and Berlin, Paris and New York, and more recently in Ballarat. And Sharon, welcome. Where are we speaking to you from? And what time is it?
Copenhagen. I think it's 6:30 or 7 a.m., something like that, and it's Copenhagen, Denmark.
Well, thank you so much for getting up so early and joining us to talk about your incredible film, which is such a raw portrayal and so emotional and so personal. And it's a voyage of trauma that we can see through the generations. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how your background and the places that you have lived and worked led to this film, and a little bit about what you're doing at the moment, please?
Sure. That's a lot. I don't know if I'm going to remember all of it, though. So what led to this film is actually a panel discussion that I was invited to in, wow, it's now 9 years ago. It was in Munich. And I suddenly found myself being the only woman on a panel of third generations of both survivors, but also perpetrators. And the journalist who asked me to do this was actually someone I knew from my childhood. He was himself he is himself a second generation of survivor. And it was this very interesting moment because I suddenly realized that there was such a thing as a third generation and a second generation of survivors of the Holocaust. And what I mean by that is that your world of feelings suddenly get a name. Suddenly it makes sort of sense to, it's almost like a category in which your experience starts fitting in. And that also means that you're probably not alone with your experience. And suddenly you see the world through that prism. And this, on the other hand, I think that I've had actually already the material of my grandfather, to be honest. I had filmed that already, and I never knew what I was going to do with it. I knew I was going to do something with it one day. And I was already not talking to my father. That also was the case. So that was also, I'll never forget that feeling because it was going back to the place I was born, meaning Munich. I was living in Berlin, and I didn't know where my father was. And I was, sort of starting to put the pieces together of my own biography in a new way. And of course, as I say in the film, my grandparents on my mother's side, this was talked about and it was very clear. But suddenly there's this entire realization that there's a half part of me that because I'm not talking to my father, that I actually don't understand. I realize, and this was a few years later, 5 years later, I realized I didn't really understand who my father was. And this is when actually the question came up, well, so in what way is our relationship actually affected by the Shoah? Like, is the fact that we're on non-talk, I mean, of course, there are many other reasons, right? But is the Shoah sort of the reason why we are not talking? Is that one of the reasons why he is not capable of doing certain things? And so this was actually something that was really interesting to me. And then what happened, and it was sort of the synchronicity of it all, is I had already finished my first film in 2015, which was dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I had done this very first film without going to film school. So I made a feature-length documentary in the context of my master's in visual anthropology. But I had, co-produced, done part of the camera work. I said, if I'm going to be a filmmaker, that's not the way it's going to be. So I applied to go to film university. And at film university, I found out in the very first year that actually I'm not going to own the rights to the story because it's a graduate film that I'm working towards in the master's program. And then I thought, because there is another film that I was working on at the same time, which is actually dealing only with survivors, and that I'm still working on because it's still not finished. And then I thought, okay, this story is bigger than me. I cannot have I can only have this story. I don't care what happens with this film. I'm just going to do it. And if the university owns it, well, then the university owns it. That's okay. This is Germany. And there was this also interesting thing, which I said, which is, once I finish this film, I can leave Germany. And it's interesting that it's now being screened in Ballarat. Whilst I'm not there, it's still interesting. So, yeah. So I just to finish the story, it was essentially a synchronicity of multiple events that led me to making this film. Yeah.
So I'm really interested to know, given that you were estranged from your father for so long, how you convinced him to be part of it and how your relationship transformed over the filming and beyond.
So at first, and this is also very interesting, the story is that I wrote this film as a much more essayistic film. I had written an email asking him if he wanted to be a part of it, and I never got a reply. And then the film that I wrote, without him in it, but just to give you an idea, with this last image of me looking for him in Tel Aviv, very essayistic. Will he be there? Well, we don't know, right? My film gets financed fully on May 5th. My birthday is on May 7th. And 2 days later, after the financing, I get a call from my father after 7 years saying, hey, here I am. I have never received your emails. I live now in Tel Aviv. So, of course, everything changed in that moment. And he agreed. Basically, you see the agreement in the film. It is not the first scene. The first scene was that we filmed. He didn't know that I was filming. I was filming. And then I got his agreement. And after that point, I actually the first time I saw him after this time was on camera with my team in Tel Aviv. So as you see, I went, I didn't spare myself or him from the reality of a relationship. And how it was is actually pretty much what you see on screen. It was that at first, and there was nothing else. I mean, there really wasn't more than what you see. This is how we rekindled.
But we see this changing, and we see how you become more connected to your father and he opens himself up to you. But did it give you an understanding of how he behaved in the ways that you may not have understood when you were younger?
Oh, of course. Of course. Of course. I mean, obviously, when you start putting the focus on the other person, you start understanding their story. And I think that doesn't mean that you feel understood as a daughter. But as a filmmaker, and this is really the massive difference, as a filmmaker, of course, you have, especially the moment when he says in the film, that he didn't actually go and study in Jerusalem, that he actually didn't himself do what he wanted for his parents. This is for me, the symbol of second generation. Like, if you ask me, what is a second generation of survivor? This is it. They feel that they are not allowed to have a life of their own because they are parents. And we, as a third generation, do not have that direct burden. We have it differently. So, yeah.
That's very interesting. So my next question centers around the title Displaced and what this means in terms of a sense of home or belonging, which you have explored through your father and also your grandfather going through these different places. So can you talk to us a little bit about the sense of place, but I also wanted to make reference to the outstanding visuals of the cinematography and how you captured all the different locations, which also developed their own personalities. And there's a lot of silence and minimal conversation in specific places. And I wanted to make reference to the ruined synagogue, for example, which is it's like a skeleton in a sparse landscape in Poland, and also that ghost sign of the name Ryba, which remains above your grandparents' former shop. And all of this creates to a sense of geographical and locational uneasiness. Is there anywhere that you feel comfortable? Because I know that you have lived in various places and you have a connection to places that you both lived in but didn't live in, but visited, but you've got that ancestral connection.
I think that I'm very privileged. And I think that because I am who I am, I'm lucky to feel connected pretty much anywhere and everywhere I go in some way. So that is the short but the very honest answer. I can find a connection to any place I'll live in, and that'll be fine. I don't need to have a home that is beyond the one that I create with the people that I love, and my family. That is plenty, and that's more than many have. So, and displacement is something that you feel on the inside. What I will say is that displacement is a sense that you get, I believe, also for not feeling recognized, when you are calling a place your home. So, and this is why the title is so important, because they are a camp for displaced people. My grandparents were not in one of them in Germany. And displacement is really, I think, this unseen feeling of having a connection to, a traumatic history that you see, but that no one else sees. And the visuals are nothing else but my translation or embodiment. They're an embodiment of that, of what in film studies many will call trauma aesthetics, or so yeah. And the when I stood there at the synagogue, in Jelošice, and this man was just talking on the phone, my team understood what I felt, because my DOP is Israeli, and my team was very sensitive, and they felt and realized as we went on a journey together. But you could see how everyone else was just living their lives. And, places have meanings because you give them meanings, because they mean something to you in your culture, in your story. And this is what I tried to show throughout the film. That that for me, a place that once used to be a synagogue, and where the only sound that resonates are pigeons, the pigeon sounds were so loud. I will never forget that sound, That is just, it's something that you can be so easily unaware of. And I think the beauty of cinema is that we can actually shine a light on those things that are unseen.
Thanks, Sharon. I was thinking about my own experiences when I was visiting Warsaw, which is where my grandfather was from. And you have this sense that you want to understand the streets that your ancestors walked on, for example, and to put yourself in their shoes and experience what they experienced. So I found those images, and I'm sure other people did here, found them very emotional and powerful. So thank you. And you've said that the past feels present when we are dealing with historical trauma. When you're walking through these previously unknown landscapes, how it, we're talking about how it affects your understanding of your grandparents. And I was curious as to whether your father had visited these places. So did he talk to you about whether he didn't want to or consciously avoided them, or he just didn't feel the need to go back to places such as Beijing or in Poland.
That's it.
Yeah.
He,
Mm.
he may have been in Ravensbrück, for instance, but he will go to Prague and visit the Jewish quarter and go on a, for
Mm.
instance, but nothing that relates personally. He had never been, and it was the first time that he'd found out about his family tree.
Mm. That's really interesting. Um, so I'm interested to hear about some of the challenges you faced because you were filming your own story. You were the cinematographer as well as one of the key protagonists.
I'm not the
And
cinematographer.
okay,
I was not that's, yeah.
okay,
That would have been
my
impossible.
apologies. But you were directing the narrative. Okay, and one of the themes centers on the legacies of the perpetrators, and in key scenes, you met up with friends from your childhood. And one of the women said that she doesn't perceive you as Jewish. So, and then we have some very interesting body language from the group of women that you were interviewing. And you were challenging them and the meaning of friendship, which I found absolutely telling and fascinating. Um, did the responses on camera shock you at all, or you were not surprised? And was there any fallout or aftermath when the cameras stopped rolling?
Mhm. Um, no, actually, as a matter of fact, that scene with my friend on her own had been already shot.
Okay.
Um, I mean, I shot that very scene in my research material, and she pretty much said the same thing a couple of years earlier. There was no falling out. There was, I was at the wedding of one of them in July last year. I think there was growth.
Mm.
Um, but I want to acknowledge, because one of them lives now in Copenhagen, actually, so I just saw her, that this was being on camera is a sign of friendship. And I think that's important, as difficult what it is that they're saying, and as I'll just, call it as is, limited and not understanding. And it is what happens when you are when, a minority meets a dominant society. And I'm convinced that this would be different in a different place. Um, you know, Displaced has had a lot of has had a really shocking effect on many non-Jewish Germans. It's just, you can say it is just the way it is. It's been an eye-opener for many, for those who've wanted to take a look at it. And the body language is actually something that in part they are unaware of. And only once they've seen the film, they become actually aware of what it is that is happening. So that goes to show you, and that's been my proof, to show you that, we embody histories and we're very often totally unaware of what these histories do with us and how they shape us as people.
Absolutely. And recognizing, obviously, people are not responsible for the actions of their grandparents, but they can make that decision of how they want to act in society. So, and it can be very confronting. And we're talking about inheritance of behaviors through, epigenetics, but it can also go the other way, where you can recognize and realize what is the right thing to do, and how we can go forward. You've also used the term invisible wound in your podcast series that focuses on intergenerational trauma and private suffering, or suffering that's not in the public eye. And your podcasts feature Australian Indigenous peoples, including our beloved Uncle Boydie, Arthur Turner, who is the grandson of William Cooper, who advocated for Aboriginal rights and famously led a protest against the actions of the Nazi regime after Kristallnacht in 1938. What did you know of our First Nations people before you came to Australia, and what motivated your work on that series of podcasts, Sharon?
Mm-hmm. So it was such an incredible synchronicity of events. So my film was supposed to be in cinemas in Germany on the 9th of November 2020. And because of the lockdowns, of course, there were no cinemas open. Instead of that, the Jewish newspaper asked me to do an interview, and I did. And on that very day, there was an article about William Cooper and about Uncle Boydie. And that is how I came across that story. And I was so, I mean, I have no words to describe how that felt to me. And I was in Germany. I had never been to Australia, might I add. And I was not in Australia when I actually recorded that podcast. And I had never been to Australia. But this article was one of the reasons why I had already decided I was going to do a PhD, and I knew I was going to focus on how to represent collective transgenerational trauma. What ended up happening is I decided that the focus would be how to represent or ask the question, how is collective transgenerational trauma represented in Indigenous Australian documentary cinema, to be very specific. And because I couldn't travel, essentially what happened is that I decided to be proactive, and I was able to create sources. And I actually asked, I got the series funded. And then I was like, this is the first way that's the only way I can actually get a sense and a feeling, and I can learn about the First Nations without being in Australia. And that's what I did. So this was besides, reading, obviously, but that's a very different feeling. So I didn't know anything before I did the series, or only the reading that I had done, which is, there's not that much actually. I mean, there is a lot, but then also many of the sources are not available in Europe. So when I say there's not a lot, I just want to say I was in Berlin at that stage and in lockdown. Yeah, I don't know I don't remember the second part of the question. Sorry.
Well, we could talk about the connection between intergenerational trauma and the effects of private, the whole idea about the invisible wound as being something that is kept inside you when you are part of either, something that has affected you personally, or something that's affected your your people, your community, and how you can see the comparisons between Holocaust survivors and their descendants, as well as Australian First Nations people who have been through, genocide and the stolen generation and other, terrible injustices.
So to me, it became also really quintessential to ask that question because, the question of whether or not the Holocaust is unique is a topic that's being a lot discussed in Europe and that I was being faced with. And so for me, I wanted to find also an answer for myself on how to, handle that question. What does that actually mean? And what I found and what I believe to be true is that the specifics of history are the specifics of history, and the specifics of a people are the specifics of a people and of a specific trauma. However, the damage of collective transgenerational trauma that we suffer, that exists. And that is, it doesn't matter in which, it doesn't matter if you speak, because my second season, was with, I spoke to a Yazidi woman. I spoke also to a woman from Rwanda. I mean, there is a common denominator. And I think it's very important to acknowledge and recognize that there is a common denominator, because it actually forces us to look completely differently at our actions and at history yet again. And of course, this is very, very present in Australia, and I see it all over, and I see the comparisons. And, I see it when I speak with, First Nation mob, and I see it, even though I'm on the other side, um, and this is very interesting to me, it's horrifying, and it's terrible that we're at that stage still, basically.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sharon. And I think that films such as Displaced, while they're very specific to the experiences of Holocaust survivors, have that element which can be applicable to, wider traumas and other examples. While, we can say that each genocide should be considered unique in its own way and not be compared because it should be considered as a standalone. You can see that there are specific commonalities. So that leads on to what I wanted to ask you about. What discussions or legacy did you and do you hope this film would generate to a public that may not have experienced this type of trauma in their background?
You've actually already mentioned it. I think that to actually apply to oneself, to ask questions about one's own history, to trust and believe that one's own history has affected us, and to go and ask questions and to take responsibility. I think that this is what I hope for, and for a wider audience.
Thanks, Sharon. And the film has been screened across the world. What are some of the memorable responses that were specific to particular places that you might want to mention?
Mm-hmm. So I was really surprised that the film worked for a genuinely younger audience in Portugal, who actually, it was screened in a small, tiny festival in the north of Portugal where I was there, and people were genuinely moved and totally understood the connection with their colonial history. So that was absolutely fascinating for me to see. The film was also screened in South Africa at the Encounters Documentary Festival, and there again, there was a woman who was, South African and German. So she had a background, and she has a, perpetrator family background. And she was, it just affected her. And that was really surprising that even though she doesn't live in Germany anymore, she still reached out, and this is always story. This means that these people have actually reached out to me after the screening. So I don't know of those who haven't. And now more recently in November, the film was actually on German television and on VOD. And it's done quite well. And there was really, I was getting a lot of emails from, so it's actually worked in Germany. And now in a couple of weeks, it's actually traveling to Taipei. Because there is a massive broadcasters conference. And so I'm going to be having a talk with actually a Japanese broadcaster who said that the film has very much affected her. So what I'm trying to see is that suddenly the world is becoming a smaller place, in that sense. And yes, it has been screened in Sydney. But I must add, it was a mostly Jewish audience in Sydney. So there was resonance, obviously. But yes.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. And, I think that when you do have an audience whose parents or grandparents were, had, or even the audience themselves who have gone through genocide or other forms of oppression, it has that direct link. And I'm really hoping that this will be screening again in Melbourne at the Holocaust Museum. So I hope to meet you then when you're back in Australia. So I think we will finish up here. Sharon, thank you again for joining us, and thanks for getting up so early in the morning. Wishing you all your success for your work in Copenhagen. And thank you to the Eureka Centre for bringing this film to the Ballarat audience, and for the Harmony Festival, and for inviting me to join you. Thanks so much for coming. I hope it's inspired a lot of thought and consideration for living with the legacies of trauma. Thank you so much.